Hello, everybody, and welcome back to AACRAO's Credential Chats. And we are joined with a repeat guest this episode with Janet Schreck. She is Vice Provost for Education and Innovation at Johns Hopkins University. Janet, welcome back to Credential Chats.
Thanks, Noah. Glad to be back.
Yeah, and I was really excited to talk with you because I got to see your awesome presentation recently at the One EdTech Digital Credentials Summit. And you have come a long way. And so I thought it would be really fun to check back in with you and hear all about what you're doing at Johns Hopkins University, especially in regards to the co-curricular work of transcripting and CLR. So yeah, maybe just before we dive in too deep, if you could kind of reacquaint folks of just where you were and how you got to where you are.
You are absolutely, and we have been very busy and excited to innovate in this space. So, at Hopkins, I oversee two different worlds, I call them, around credentialing. One is our non-degree, non-credit space, and I think for this discussion, I'm just going to leave that one aside. But we do have a micro-credentials framework and a governance process for that work. But the co-curricular really relates to our students, our enrolled students across our undergrad, master's, and doctoral programs. And so we've been working for a long time. Feels like many, 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 many years on a comprehensive learner record initiative for those students. I think a series of challenges around what we were kind of early in the CLR space. What does that mean? Trying to find the right tech vendor, vendors change. And then while that's happening, the field's changing. And then all of a sudden we have new nomenclature like LER instead of a CLR. Is an LER a CLR? So anyway, all that work's been happening. But what we've got now at Hopkins is our first prototype. We work with Heliocampus Assessment, and we have our first prototype of our comprehensive learner record for Johns Hopkins. And our vision for that is that that is an accompaniment will sit alongside the student's traditional transcript, and that the CLR will show for them all of the learning achievements they've achieved in their curricular sort of traditional coursework space and also their co-curricular opportunities, which could be a whole series of things: internships, research experiences. It could be non-degree, non-credit courses that accompanied, some learning objectives in their academic program. And so that's been what we've been really focused on lately is how do we capture that? How do we work on the governance around that? And how do we make sure that's shown in the CLR in a really in a helpful way for students as they work towards their next step in terms of employment or graduate school?
Well, and I think that's just one of the things I so admire about you because I think you were one of the first folks that when I started working in higher ed that I got to connect with another university. And so you've been thinking about this long and hard. And as people are, dealing with this credential confusion, they're very interested in governance. And, I think that to see an institution like Johns Hopkins embracing some of these co-curricular, non-curricular, things that are not necessarily credit bearing and saying, this is important for us to formally recognize. What lessons can you share just as you talk about the governance of where you got to where you are, like as far as especially what counts?
Yeah.
How did you get to that place and what lessons learned can you share?
Yeah, well, we joke. I mean, there's different third rails in higher education, right? And I feel like co-curricular is a little bit of the third rail sometimes because it's a space where there are a lot of players, but it's not clear who sort of owns it. And that's always one of the
Mm.
things in higher ed we're always looking at is like who owns, right? And so, we have our colleagues in student affairs, in our career center, which we call life design, in athletics, who are really doing a lot of great education for our students, but don't always get the recognition from our faculty. And I am a faculty member, so I will own that as those being sort of an equal learning opportunity or something that's kind of co-learning alongside the traditional coursework curricular learning. And so the very first thing we had to do was figure out how we could, in a thoughtful way, have that honest discussion and that honest debate. And higher ed, we like to form a committee So we formed a committee, right? But that committee had all those representatives, right? So it had folks from student affairs, life design. We had people from the curricular aspects of the program. So we had faculty, leaders of assessment in those spaces. And we talked about, what is our definition? I think there's a lot of
Mm.
confusion, right? There's some people interchange extracurricular with co-curricular. So we actually worked on a taxonomy of definitions of what is curricular, what is co-curricular, and what is extracurricular. And that took a long time. We had a lot of debates about that, but that was sort of the place where we got to some basic agreement. And we said that, co-curricular has to have some learning relationship to the objectives of the curricular program. That was the decision. Doesn't mean, even though we ultimately will say the faculty own the curriculum. So in some ways, they're sort of the final sign off on that. They were open to saying, but we recognize that our colleagues might be teaching some of that in spaces that are not controlled by our faculty or our classrooms. And then from there, we work through kind of then what kind of measurement of learning would you need to be able to capture that into the comprehensive learner record. And I think even more tricky, and we're still working through this, is what are the overarching like program outcomes or objectives that we want to set to map those two, right? So there's like the
Mm.
NACE competencies, we have a career set of learning outcomes that our career center uses. And so, we've tried to build it pretty flexible that you can actually maybe align to both of those, right? Like NACE and a curricular one. We have something called the foundational abilities, which are our undergraduate learning aims. Like we might see a co-curricular that aligns to both NACE and one of our curricular, foundational abilities. So I think, that was a big culture step for us. It also took, quite truthfully, one of the lessons learned was our life design space, which is again our career services, tried to lead this work and got a lot of pushback. And I think it was because the faculty were like, wait a minute, why is a non-faculty group leading this? So having it come out of the provost office for me, who oversees academic affairs and has a faculty appointment, just positionally, I think felt different. And we just gave people a lot of safety and trust to say, we're going to take our time and work this through and really get to some agreement. So we do actually have a white paper now that lists out that taxonomy about co-curricular learning, talks about the ways you can assess it. And everybody signed off after, a few little quibbles over wording on that white paper. So we now have kind of a shared agreement that everybody's working on.
And you mentioned this was my next question was going to be for that committee, under whose sponsorship it was, and for anybody who wants to follow in your footsteps, what did you call the committee?
I don't think I'd like to say we had a fancy name. So we at Hopkins, just to start off with the fact that I'm just going to say we have some hubris here. We have an overarching university-wide assessment committee called the University Committee on Learning Assessment. And if you pull up the acronym for that, that's UCLA. So we actually do call it UCLA, which is embarrassing to start. From there, UCLA charged a subcommittee, an ad hoc committee on co-curricular learning assessment. So I don't think it had a fancier name than that, but the idea was ad hoc in the sense that they wanted to start the work. And then actually one of the recommendations from that ad hoc committee was, we think that UCLA needs to maintain a permanent co-curricular learning assessment subcommittee. So, because originally those folks weren't necessarily represented. Some of those folks were not represented on the broader UCLA structure, which was much more originally conceived as traditional learning assessment. So now we have a permanently standing subcommittee that is branched off of that learning assessment broader structure that works on these things and is going to continue to refine those guidelines. And as we continue to implement, go back in and work through the things that we didn't think about or that start to be a rub once we actually get into full-blown implementation at a larger scale. I
I
probably need to give them a much snazzier name now that you said that, though.
Yeah, and longer acronym probably with it being
Yeah,
higher ed. One of the things I'm hearing, Jen, is um, that for all the technology we always talk about, a lot of what you've modeled at Hopkins is change management.
yeah.
And they're just human level stuff. I hear you using the trust word. And another word that I'm hearing you use a lot is assessment. And so, is different sort of handling of that assessment word a big kind of key factor in the building of trust?
Yeah, and I think, sometimes I feel like when we start talking sort of faculty to non-faculty colleagues, we have to be careful because we're not all using the same words in the same way. So like one example was sometimes our student affair colleagues would say, we do assessment, but the assessment will look to me like a program evaluation, right? It would be like, how did you like this program? And how would you rate it on a 1 to 5? Would you recommend it to a friend? And it took some, again, trustful conversations to say, that's not actually what we want to measure. We want to measure what the students learned. And I think out of full respect, that's something I wish higher ed that we all did as a better job is um, teaching our student affairs colleagues and our career development colleagues, how it is you assess. I actually, ironically, have a doctoral student I'm advising right now, and she and I are co-authoring a paper on this because she was working on a curriculum, and I was like, these are really great, but these aren't learning objectives. These are like program evaluation objectives. And she's like, what do you mean? And I said, hey, let's look at Bloom's taxonomy, right? And again, I think it's just not where they come from. And so it's not so much. And so I think there's this look down upon of like, well, you're not really teaching anything. You don't really measure anything. They are teaching amazing skills, particularly the real skills that I think are transition skills into life, right? Like leading a student government association certainly has a lot of, transferable employability skills that you're not going to get out of necessarily sitting in a traditional course. But I think it's this like, how do we all get to the shared understanding of what we mean by assessment? And what do we mean by like, what is it that students need to recognize they're learning? And what are the words and the vocabulary to give them to name that so that when they go into an interview with a CLR or not, they can actually use those words, right? I was
Yeah.
the student government president, and in that I learned how to lead a meeting, how to lead, culture change. I learned how to deal with conflict. I learned how to be a member of a team, like all those things that the employers are looking for that I don't think we do a good job of teaching students sort of that like metacognition piece of
Mm.
teaching them those words.
Yeah, and Jenna, I just want to validate for you the importance of that distinction between evaluate and assess
Yep.
because I thought that the phrase a collective gasp was just a literary thing that didn't actually happen in real life until I was in a room full of registrars at the Convergence conference and I treated those two words interchangeably and I experienced a collective gasp. But
That's so
I can totally validate that they are different. It is important to know the difference. And for any of our viewers, when Jen's talking about NACE, she's mentioned that a few times. The line of those as the National Association of Colleges Employers, and they have a framework of work readiness standards that in the metadata in our digital credentials and verifiable credentials, such as a CLR, we can actually align to things like the NACE competencies. I want to end with one quick theoretical one. You mentioned athletics, Janet. So this is the first time we've done this ever on Credential Chat. So hopefully I'm not putting you uncomfortably on the spot.
uh-oh.
But this is a does it count or does it not count? You mentioned athletics, you
Yep.
mentioned NACE conces, you mentioned things that might be valuable, for our graduates in the real world. And I'm thinking that lacrosse players at Hopkins have demonstrated a skill, on national TV that we can assess and we can verify and validate that they can go 90 minutes without checking their cell phones. And I think that there's a lot of employers who would really value that. At Johns Hopkins University, could that be something in the CLR with evidence attached of a 90-minute long video that there is a setting
I
they could go 90 minutes without being on their cell phones in a professional setting? Is that
I,
worthy of the CLR?
I think we could certainly put that through our co-curricular, if, our group, our working group, and decide if that's actually measure, and it certainly is measurable. That's interesting. But I just will say quickly, our athletics group has an amazing leadership curriculum. And that is what, like, they have like a true curriculum with measurable outcomes. Now, I'm not sure if that's one of them, and maybe I should encourage them to include that. But again, like, I think it's an untapped place that we don't always think to look for that learning that's happening, that they actually teach students about leadership and they actually measure how effective they are in leading across different levels of opportunity throughout their 4 years. And so, I think as educators, we need to be better about embracing those things. I'll have to get back to you about the 90 minutes. And, the question is, can they do that if they're sitting in front of a computer and not running up and down the field? But we may have to test that out.
I guess we could qualify it, but yeah, 100%. And I may be reaching out to you, Jen, for a copy of those measurables because we at our university we also have leadership program out of athletics, and
Yeah.
they are talking to us about proposing micro credentials around. So definitely you're not alone on that. Folks, she is Jen Schreck, Vice Provost for Education Innovation at Johns Hopkins University. Janet, thank you so much for joining us again on AACRAO's Credential Chats.
Happy to be here, Noah, and hope I get invited back again at some other point.
I hope so too. Thank you so much. And thank you, everybody, for sharing the valuable currency of your time and engagement with us here on AACRAO's Credential Chats. And until next time, have a badge-worthy week, everybody. So long.